Okay, as we head towards a court case with both the Human Awareness Institute, which will be a broader framework, and secondarily with each of you as high facilitators, I want to help you understand the issues that are in tension, the issues that I will need to have resolved before stopping, what may be 1 to 10 years of different cases that practically will result in the dissolution of the organization and the inability of any of you to do this work effectively, one-on-one, or will result in these issues being addressed. And I want to invite an awareness of 6 of us, for each of you that is present for this, which is a courtesy, since most people don't have this congenial a dialogue about court. But perhaps if you understand the way I see you and the way I see myself, it will make sense. So when I look at myself, I see a core energy that has always been seeking to bring awareness, and a lot of that is just through light, to bring light through awareness. That's a lot of who I am. And I believe that, as with homeopathy, as with any medicine, that understanding the situation, the reality, is a third of the medicine. Because I believe in the core essence of each of us as human beings. I believe it is always working to bring about a harmonious, sustainable, beautiful complexity of some form. So that part is at work in me and in you at this moment. It is the core. It is what each of us have come in with. I also think that each of us embody the cultural wound, the object that is much bigger than the ego, much bigger than the individual self, that is shoved into the self, in the personality, in the traumatic cycle, into the body, in so many ways, with a very heavy hammer, the hammer of shame, the hammer of trauma, etc. So we are the cultural wound, and that's for better or worse. The cultural wound gives us language, and the language in and of itself separates us, which is particularly poignant for me, with language being my primary love language. The reason Peter hit the ball out of the park with his apology was he was humble enough to actually hear my language, which is one of the points that I'll be addressing, because it is critical. It is a critical principle in medicine to attune to the patient, not to ask the patient to attune to the doctor, to attune to the child, not to ask the child to attune to the parent. And that is particularly the case in abusive contexts where scale is at play. You are an organizational body in relationship to one individual, in a vertical relationship in which you have 100-to-1 scale because of your roles, because of your cohesiveness as a group, because of your intersection with Maslow's hierarchy of, in belonging, because you are the figureheads of my primary source of prior, belonging. I couldn't be talking with you if you were still the primary source, because it's been so toxic. And what we know in the hierarchy of needs is that when the first needs are not met, the other needs implode, and kind of a person will become self-destructive in the higher levels if necessary to sustain the security, survival, etc., and pay whatever price is demanded by the power structure. When you hold the primary key to belonging, you are the power structure of that need, just like the US government is the power structure for most of our needs of security and survival. And when that is abused, it is a profound violation. It reduces the self down to this core, small level. Now, the final part in this dialogue is the coping strategy, meaning you cannot take a 10-ton object and whack it into the core energy of the self without creating extraordinary trauma and extraordinary suffering. And we each carry that trauma and that suffering inside. And so the final part that we are always in relationship with is what's called the coping mechanism of the pain, of the trauma. We are who we are. We embody enough of the cultural wound such that the culture in the contract of brainwashing and embodiment and enculturation allows us to survive. The culture, like an immune system, is weakening, attacking, abandoning, imprisoning, shooting, killing, betraying, shunning. The culture, like an immune system, is constantly alienating parts of who we are, marginalizing parts of who we are to protect itself, not to protect the essence of the individual. This is extraordinarily painful. And so coping mechanisms, which when dealing with pain and trauma have a compulsive element, meaning there will be a coping mechanism and it will be more powerful than the ego, as long as we're dealing in this terrain, which we are in our culture. We are a traumatized culture in which our security and survival is not assured and is in jeopardy by the culture itself in a whole wide variety of ways, as you're well aware from your own emotional reactions to realizing that just having something to do with mushrooms could put your freedom in jeopardy. This is not a friendly cultural environment. So we're dealing with who we are. We're dealing with the imprint of the culture, positive and negative, and we're dealing with the coping mechanism. The coping mechanism that in some ways is bigger than the sense of free choice of you and I. And if anyone looks at this kind of situation as puzzle pieces without compulsion, that it's so funny. Here's bunch of people dedicating their lives to healthy relationships, spending tons of money, doing this, doing that. All you have to do, this one has to do this one has to do this one has to do this, and the energy flows through gracefully. What's the problem? You see, the problem is you're not an idiot. The problem is I'm not an idiot. The problem is that the coping mechanism for dealing with these primal survival instincts, etc., is not in the domain of rational free choice. It's in the domain of an addiction, which is a phenomena that medicates those states which are bigger than our ego is comfortable responding to. Now, I know exactly what that's like because I've been in that state my entire life. I know exactly what it's like to tentatively go up to this wall and start to feel, is there softness over here? Is there softness over there? Is there softness over here? I know what it's like to be engulfed and absorbed in something that is so big that I would go crazy, that I would lose all touch with boundary, that I would do anything to escape the overwhelming mass of that energy. I know exactly what that's like because I've been dealing with it since I was 2 years old. And if you're in denial about that, you will know what that's like before this court and documentary is out, because it will bring you face to face with forces of inside of you that are bigger than your sense of you. And no one will go into that voluntarily. It is an incredible honor to be anywhere near this terrain. And this is the terrain that was violated. This is the terrain that was violated. When Peter Sandhill, someone each of you chose, trained, recommended, and then abandoned, pushed hard against his client and patient for triple the dose, encouraged and suggested an overlay of another substance, escalated romance, and promised, as his way of assuaging the terror of going close to that energy wall that's bigger than the ego, promised that he would take a Gandalf stand, a stand that no human being has ever taken for me, that no human being has ever promised to take for me, and thus reenacted the childhood trauma. Only this time it was paid. And what you are dealing with is a force that is bigger than my ego. And I'm in relationship with that force, trying to survive in relationship to something that is bigger than I can understand, that is bigger than I can tolerate feeling, that is terrifying in its unknown unknown, and that I have entered as a result of trusting each of you, and in turn trusting Peter Sandhill, and in turn, because I trusted each of you to recommend Peter Sandhill, I trusted each of your 30 promises. You have each stated a mission statement, commitment to a world in which everyone wins. And to me, you see, and you don't get to make proclamations and promises that are that vague and then have them interpreted the way you want them interpreted. Now, most likely, since it's that vague, each of you has a different story about what you meant when you said that to me. We're committed to a world in which everyone wins. You see, but you didn't take the time to explain what each of you meant saying that in the 30 workshops that I've attended. And so you aren't accountable to whatever it is you meant by that. You are accountable to what I hear. And you are accountable for the impact you have when your actions go from committed to an entire world to, in fact, we're going to go so far to the opposite at the time you need it most that this isn't even a high issue. It's not even a high issue that a high facilitator trained and recommended by us takes you into life-threatening trauma. Not an issue. You see, that betrayal of the promise and the action is enormous and fuels, it just pours jet fuel all over a smoldering energy that is already ready to erupt. And this is your fire. You see, and we have a delusion in our culture. We have a delusion that gardeners don't have. We have a delusion that you can take a rose and put it in the shade. You can deny it water. You can give it IOUs. You can tell the rose, we wish you well, we love you. You can write notes on the rose's leaf. We're committed to your well-being. We have an illusion in this culture that you can stick a rose in poor soil. And that if we do all that and wish it well and say you're at choice and all that, that the rose will just say, gee, I'd like to grow happily in shade and terrible soil and all this. I'd love to do this. And then what we do is we look for the exceptions because our cultural soil is weak. It's unbalanced. It's toxic. It's shame-based. We have a hostile shade-like soil for our emotions, etc. We have this illusion that we can hold the rose accountable for the gardener's choices. And we emphasize this by pointing to people like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. And what we're really saying is that we have a soil that is so terrible that out of 300 million people, there's 2 out of them that we think are great. Like, look at them, why don't you be like them? In other words, why don't we plant 300 million roses in the dark with toxic soil? And if we just keep doing enough of it, maybe one of them, for some freak genetic reason, whatever, is going to grow and stay alive in the shade, at least somewhat. And then we'll all say to the other roses, be like them, rather than what any intelligent gardener does, which is basically looks at the plant, takes full ownership of the environment, and changes the environment until 99% of those plants, that's my threshold. It's like if I plant 300 plants, my goal is that 297 of those plants are going to win. And it's my job to sort it out if they don't. Now, people are a lot more complicated than plants. They need mental soil. They need emotional soil. And we are not doing very well as a culture. And it has very little to do with the quality of the essence that is coming into our infants. In other words, I am absolutely assured from my travels and from little experiments like Thai people being raised in Australia or Australia people being raised in Thailand, or, my experiments show that it's the soil that produces the person. And that, yes, the essence has its unique flavor, but it's the soil. And so you are my soil. You are the figureheads, the leaders of the soil of the Human Awareness Institute. And that soil has disease. One of the first things at issue here, in my first 3 high workshops, 1, 2, and 3 in 1993, I experienced emotional and, in one case, physical trauma. And in all 3 of the workshops. And part of the soil, the mental soil, is the language. The language. To know what trauma is, to know that it exists, to know that it's going to happen here, to know how to respond to it. You took me in, you said, we're committed to you winning. But we're talking about 3 out of 3 of the very first workshops. Trauma, trauma, trauma. And your depth of commitment did not even go as deep as to gather the data. There was no questionnaire. Did you leave your body? Yes. I left my body in every large group share. Dissociation. There was no, what do we need to do here about that? There was no, here's where you can go. There was the message again and again. We love you. Come and do this. This is love. And I can assure you that my traumatic symptoms steadily rose in my intersection with the community, and that I traumatized other members of the community, and that I was traumatized by other members of the community. And this must be measured, educated, and responded to for this body of work to be loving to the people involved. And this is a stand that I have asked you to take, and you have thrown it back at me. Jason said, this is not a high issue. I asked Peter Sandhill, will you invite the team to form a trauma group? He said yes, then he changed his mind. I asked each of you to read the book to know what you didn't know. Jason said yes, Peter said yes, Sarah said yes, Anne said she's starting to learn some things. How about the rest of you? You see, when Louis Pasteur first learned that germs were killing people in his battlefield, he basically wanted to know why. As a French surgeon on the battlefield, so many people died after the surgery. And he came up with germ theory. He was humiliated, he was laughed at, he was ignored, and people were murdered on the surgery table for years. When Louis Pasteur began to wash his hands. This is a sad pattern in our culture. Someone has died since this came up. a trauma survivor who was not taught about trauma, died in trauma in the hands of a sociopathic man who is also a high client. She's dead now because this isn't a high issue, because this isn't your issue. And despite your attitude, despite your fumblings, despite your misguided loyalty, the misguided, you think you're protecting an organization. You're not. You're protecting the hearts and minds of people. And if you are not protecting, loving, and healing the hearts and minds of people, your organization shouldn't exist. And if you are, know who your real loyalty belongs to. It's to the people. That's the contract. You get to be leader on condition that you will do whatever it takes to protect your people. You do not get to be leader if you are not willing to do that. In the terrain of trust and love, it's that simple. Watch Simon Sinek. He's bringing this in a beautiful way to the corporate world. So this is issue number 1. Trauma must be educated, must be allowed for, expected, and prepared. And it must receive a response within the community. It is sociopathic to invite people with traumatic history. This is like inviting someone with an allergen and saying this is great food prepared with love, and you kill them because you didn't bother to take the time to know what you didn't know, to learn what real medicine is for that person. So this is actually, very big as an object that needs to shift. And it needs to shift in a way. It needs to shift in a way where you, as an organization and as individuals, are the number one proponents of the shift. If you are the enemy, you must be removed from the role, because the role of leader in this terrain demands that we have people passionate in understanding trauma and protecting one another from the coping mechanism that will be unleashed within the community anytime that trauma is dishonored and the force that is bigger than the ego can cope with enters the domain of play and relationship, and there is no effective medicine within the community, which there is not. That's a big aha. I have not received effective medicine from you or the community. When there is no effective medicine, the coping mechanism which responds to the energy that's bigger than the ego, the wound, will dominate the interaction and will create destruction, pain, etc. within anyone in the life, etc., the body. And this will destroy the community. It is destroying the community. And there is only one response that is effective in this. And it is a circle, meaning one individual cannot hold a coping mechanism and addiction. You need a group. What's the problem? The coping mechanism is distracting and protecting the individual from an energy that is bigger than that individual can deal with alone. That's the primary job of a coping mechanism, is distraction from the overwhelm of something the individual cannot deal with. And an individual will get into a fight about toothpaste. An individual will cheat on their partner. An individual will lie. An individual will steal. An individual will kill. An individual will addict. An individual will do whatever it takes to not be in the presence alone of an ego-obliterating energy. And if we understand that we each have an ego-obliterating energy that is packed with more shame and pain than any individual can deal with, we will do the only intelligent thing that there is to do, which is to create a circle that can hold the size of the wound until the wave passes and the individual can take it on after there. It's kind of like every, certain traumatic triggers will generate a 2-ton weight. And that's either going to crush the individual or the community, or as that wave is starting to erupt and turn on, a circle can all take about 100 pounds. Give the person the breathing space they need, the weight diminishes, and that circle is there, and this provides positive growth. This is the environment in which the authentic self takes the lead again. Where is that weight coming from? How do I give it back to the culture? How do I give it back to my abuser? So this is absolutely essential. I believe it is the number one important variable that if High or any community does this well, it will survive. If it does not, the odds are highly in favor of a ricocheting effect of one of these large energies, maybe this energy right here, ricocheting through the community, triggering one large energy after the other, and there's no group to hold it because we're in the myopia of the individual dealing with energies that an individual cannot lift on their own. There's nothing shameful about saying that you cannot personally lift a 900-pound weight. There is something very concerning about the shame that says you should do it, and the shame that tries and fails and stays in secrecy and isolation, trying to lift a weight the body cannot deal with. And our physical body gives us clues in a culture of a mental, emotional illiteracy. Our physical body gives us clues. So this is very, very big. And it's also something that I know cannot be done. I mean, this kind of thing can't be mandated by the courts. So what I'm holding humility for, this is the unknown. As you go to court, and as this story is told, it will, of course, trigger large pains within you. And the question here is, will you get help? Will you ask for help? Will you form a circle that lifts the weight and form closer communities so that you survive that energy and come back to who you are? See, because who you are is not my enemy. Your coping mechanism is my enemy. About 60% of the cultural wound that you carry is my enemy. But you have never been my enemy. So the real question in this dance is, you have to understand medicine to understand that secrecy is toxic for an individual in this situation. Secrecy is toxic. The most medicinal response to that toxicity is for the entire community to understand exactly what I'm dealing with and to have as much weight lifted from me as possible. That is 100% medicine. And what does that look like? What does that look like? Dear community, I, Peter Sandhill, violated therapeutic guidelines. I violated marital guidelines, not including my wife in a big decision that affected her and that might affect her, not including her. I violated ethical and relational healthy practices. And I hurt one of our community members. I promised something I was unwilling and unable to deliver in the way that it was needed. And Dane has been hurting like mad. And this has illuminated the fact that we do not have a trauma response protocol, that we are not integrating the knowledge of trauma effectively. And I'm sorry, I apologize to every single person that is affected by this statement, by da-da-da-da-da. I am sorry for that. I am seeking help for my hubris, for my boundarylessness. I sincerely apologize. If this has any impact on you, please deal with me. This should never have happened to Dane. He needs support. Please send him energy, welcome him, listen to him. This would be a kindness to us. And Dane is committed. He has shared so much stuff that we're learning about. And we're going to be back in touch. Something like this is taking the weight off. Why? Why wait? Do you know how much weight I have to carry every time I meet a community member? How you doing? Terrible. Well, I wasn't expecting that answer. You're usually so positive, blah, 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 blah. Well, I am. A high facilitator abused me. Gee, I've got to run. Hurts. They're confused. Their loyalties are pulled. I have to hold their reaction. What? See, I have to hold their feelings because you won't. And this is one of the reasons this has to go to court. Because you may not be able to deal with this. You may not have the integrity. You may not have the skill. You may not have the resources. I don't know. You haven't shown them. You may not have them. But what I'm fighting for is that this not be labeled love, healthy relationship, that this be labeled to we don't have what it takes. Now there's an interesting spectrum, by the way, between environment and individual. Now it's a probability field. So at the bottom end of the environment, here's you and I, and the bottom end of the environment, it is so toxic, so filled with arsenic, so filled with poisonous gas, so filled with molten lead, you name it, that you can't exist in that environment for more than a second, no matter how healthy you were when you came in. And so this is complete toxicity in this environment. And this kind of environment eats every one of us in less than a second. Molten lead will kill you in less than a second. Just jump into a vat of it. So this is toxic environment. And then up here, way above our culture, we have an environment energetically, emotionally, physically that is so luminous that the most sociopathic, shame-based victim of cultural trauma bursts into exaltation mentally, emotionally, and physically. And that's up here. Now, we have, the bottom 25% of that kind of environment. We have an environment that ensures, for example, the statistics are astronomical in terms of the amount of abuse and trauma that the average American will go through. So that's you and that's me. we have a very, very toxic environment. Now, this is, of course, harder for sensitives. Sensitives amplify responsiveness to whatever is going on. I'm a sensitive. That means that every toxin that goes on in your and my interaction, I feel it 3 times more than someone who isn't. Every time that hits the break point in the bone, where the bone has been broken again and again by parental abuse, and you hit that very point and it breaks, it's another 5 times more intense. This is us interacting with the environment. We do not want to have a toxic environment. We do not want to have a toxic environment in which we champion the few exceptions that by luck, genetics, whatever, climb out of depression, terror, shame, denial, blah, 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 despite fluoride in the water, chlorine in the pools, 80,000 chemicals in the environment, dumbed down education, multimedia shaming, bullying, parental abuse, religious. Throw all this at a kid, and then the 2% escape unscathed, and then we tell the other 98% be like them, as opposed to why don't we change the environment? And then there will only be 2% that fall through the cracks, as opposed to 2% that escape the sludge that we've created mentally, emotionally, and physically. And what this experience for me has generated, because here's the paradox. You and I are above average, is the paradox. You and I are above average. But because of the intensity of my dose, because 4 of you have been my therapists, because all of you have been my community leaders, because you have been the community, because I've done 30 workshops, because I've had 30 lovers within the community, the toxic load that is within the community. I mean, there's 1/3 of the energy in the Human Awareness Institute and community that is absolutely toxic. It's toxic to everyone involved. But one of the ways that we manage risk in all that is by diversity. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I have the misfortune of putting a lot of eggs in the high basket, and the reality that I feel that toxicity much more intensely. This is another issue, that needs to be addressed. I do not believe there is anything wrong with any of you as essential people. I believe, if I look at what's happening in power structures, that you are behaving very much like the U.S. government, which is our top power structure. The U.S. government, pro-democracy, pro-human rights, pro-equal this, pro-this, that's the spout, right? But then we have black prisons. We have animal rights activists who have been reclassified as domestic terrorists, so that they get thrown into this Arcanian bill and get denied toilet paper or their ability to hug their family if they write about what's going on. And this is not so pleasant. This is the high protocol. We abuse power behind closed doors. When it comes to light, we suppress it rather than give adequate help and support. We suppress it. We disconnect people's accounts. We refuse to talk about it. We won't even apologize. Did you know that the United States has not paid its bill in reparations to Vietnam? After burning men, women, and children alive, in the name of democracy and freedom, of course, not in the name of horrendous torture and terrorism, We didn't even pay our bill in the final withdrawal settlement. Of course, there's no apology. See, you've grown up in this environment. It's toxic. It says that if you're at the top of the power structure, you're not accountable. You're not accountable to anyone else. You're not accountable to principles. You're not accountable to human impact. And that looking good is more important. You see, because there's a tension here. You apologize, I look better, you look worse. So we can't apologize, right? For the good of what? A power structure? For the good of the power structure? You see, there's a tension here. Now, of course, we can write the public statement that says we're committed to the entire world winning. And then we can have the private statement, which we won't put on our website, that says this isn't a high issue. Now, we know that's bullshit. Do you know it's bullshit? You see, because everyone else does. And we cannot have this bullshit at the top of a power structure. That is the power structure that people are depending on for insight and guidance on what is loving, what is healthy relationship. We can't have that. Which means you have a loyalty divide. You have the coping mechanism to this excruciating pain. How did this happen? Why did I do this? What's going on? Why did this have to happen now? This is your pain. And your coping mechanism, let's call this love rather than clean it up. Let's rather than call this sludge and we need to clean it and get it up to love. Let's just call sludge love. We have time to do that. We don't have time to do the other thing, So and rather than say, well, we're inadequate, meaning we don't have the resources to do a good job here and we're sorry. See, that's alerts people. That puts everyone on alert. Like, oh, okay, more resources are needed. Remember Hillary? Why did she lose? She couldn't allow for the reality that Trump might win, that they needed more help. She's above all that because she has to take that stance, right? I'm so much more superior in my position. There's no way that he could win. This would, da-da-da-da-da. That's not what was needed. That superiority, what was needed was more help. It didn't come because she didn't ask. She didn't say, this is a really crucial thing. Our country's at a volatile point, and we need all the help we can get from all of you so that this goes in a good way. Can I ask for your help? No. There's a different energy. So you've had tons of help available, but you didn't ask. So you were inadequate. You were inadequate. It's not surprising. You're dealing with your own stuff, and you're defending positions that are hard to defend. They're hard to defend. There's no ethical basis for 30 workshops of saying we recommend each other but not disclosing that we're unlicensed and doing deeper work than many therapists. There's no ethical basis for that. There's a basis for an apology. We're sorry we didn't have a safe sex conversation with you emotionally about our legal and this and that. We didn't disclose this, and this because we thought maybe you would not want to have sex with us. Now, we would have told you to talk about herpes, but we're not going to disclose the fact that we've got egomania. We're not going to disclose the fact that we've got such egomania, we don't even bother getting licensed. We're not going to disclose the fact that we don't even bother getting a license, but we don't even bother telling you that we're not licensed because we know it's all about love and it's all going to work. This is egomania. But we're not going to tell you about it because you might not want to have sex with us if we're an egomaniac. You see, and this is contagious. One of the sad things for me is looking at, because I'm a child in many ways, my first sexual experiences and things happening within the community. I'm a child of this energy field. And some of the egomania that I've been criticized for and shamed for emerges in the embodiment of what you have presented and not presented. In 1993, Peter Sandhill was my first guide about what healthy relationships were. He didn't bother taking a trauma history. He didn't ask any questions. As an emotional mental healer, he said, what do you want to work on? A doctor does not just ask their patient, would you like a toe removed? Whatever you want. I've got a bunch of instruments here. You want to saw off an arm? What do you want to work on? No, a doctor has to understand what health and love looks like and has to have a protocol for figuring out what that is. And the whole point of a professional is that they can show you stuff you didn't know. That is such a missed opportunity here. I didn't know that I didn't know about trauma. I didn't know I was a trauma survivor. I didn't know it was biological. I didn't know I had early childhood attachment issues. But I had to deal with all of that in every one of my 30 high lover relationships. And every single one had elements, some barbaric, some pretty darn good, elements of trauma. And no one has been paying attention to that. That can't happen. That cannot happen. As a healthy relationship community moves forward, trauma must be tracked. Now, app technology is where this is going. Protocols, transparency, and app technology are the medicines. So-and-so has AIDS. You need to use a condom. So-and-so has PTSD. You need to be in a relationship like this. So-and-so has panic attacks. You need to be in a relationship like this. So-and-so is highly sensitive. You need to tone it down 200%. So-and-so is this. These are mental, emotional states imprinted by the cultural wound, imprinted as part of the coping mechanism, and they cannot be worked with without help and awareness. And that awareness is not coming from you. And when it does, it's coming in a mixed bag. Ann Watts said she thought I had Asperger's syndrome. By the way, this all implicates you legally. When you say, in effect, to a court, I thought this person had Asperger's syndrome. I'm not a licensed therapist. I didn't recommend him anywhere. I didn't ensure how he was doing in the community and the workshops, etc. I didn't know what the trauma symptoms were. I didn't ask if he left his body. I didn't ask what was making him leave his body. I didn't ask about his spasms. Do you understand that I've had back spasms that have debilitated me 60% of the time in workshops, and that I did not know what that meant because I had no mental way of processing anything other than that I could be 60% sure that on Friday or Saturday, often before going to the workshops, I would develop a crippling back spasm. Now that's the body trying to say something. The question is what? I don't know what to do with those kinds of bits of information. The trouble is, the real thing to do is not to call that love. There needs to be a protocol that who's experiencing physiological stuff right now. Does anyone here know about trauma? Do you know why being with a bunch of naked people when you've been sexually, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually abused as a child might be bringing up stuff. Do you know how to deal with that? You see, if you don't take care of your people in these moments, you are using your influence, your authority, your role, your leadership to actually pull someone into psychosis. You're pulling them. You're saying, trust us, we love you. Now go into hell. Just do it like this, then like this, then like this. Then you'll be in absolute isolation, terror, and hell. And no one will know. Because we're really good at putting a smile on things in this culture. So you'll be buried down there. Everyone else will seem to be having fun. And if you're scared and withdrawn and regressed, people will leave you alone as opposed to help you out of your trauma. People would judge you as being an outsider rather than including you. If you can't go up into the group and speak about it because you're in a regressed state and you're terrified of being visible, we can all pretend that this is love, when in fact, we've induced trauma in you and we've left you there. And we don't even have the humility to ask or to include you. So the paradox is high is better than average. And yet I've experienced more trauma in my relationship with you and the community than in any other area of my life because of my exposure. I go back to my statement to Jason. You have the opportunity to be leaders in this domain. Or you can go under as an organization, as any organization that does not embrace this new dawning of cultural awareness on trauma will go obsolete. Because the people on the outside of the community who are dealing with trauma in slightly more visible ways are going to start seeing the diseases that you create but don't remedy. And they will pull the best people away. Say, no, over here is the community that deals with trauma. This is what helps relationships work. You need to apologize for your limitations. Not because there's something wrong with you. You've inherited something very wrong and unbalanced in a culture. But you need to apologize for calling that love. For calling that we're committed to everyone winning, when we're really committed to staying so insular that we don't even see what we don't see. And we put up walls that make anyone who help us see our inadequacies feel more and more unwelcome. And that's how I felt. And that's the next thing in the court case is protocol. It's not about the people. It's about the principles and the protocols. I'm sure you've noticed it, that if you meet a high person in Safeway and you haven't formed a relationship at high, they're a typical American ignoring you, da-da-da-da-da. You meet the same person at a high workshop, they're a completely different person. What's changed? Is it the person or is it the protocol? It's the protocol. And what is needed and missing are protocols for facilitator ethics, facilitator accountability, facilitator leadership. Of course, you don't need that because you've got superhuman, shame myopia. You've got egomania. So of course you don't need that. But that's exactly why you do. Because, I've been looking at how common it is for abuse victims to get the message from therapists who are in fact ineffective, but that need to feel like they're rescuing and saving people. I think Peter Sandhill has a strong case of this disease, needing to feel great, like I did it, and all this. And when someone needs attachment, for example, early attachment disorder, which I have, they get very good at knowing what the power structure needs to feel like they want them around. What's toxic about this is that when you have an uninformed, out of integrity practitioner who has agendas of their own that are superseding the ethical responsibilities of the patient, the problem with this is that the therapist will push the toxicity on the patient and then pull on the patient to say, aren't I doing it great? Don't you feel better now? Don't you feel better now? How am I doing? How am I doing? And when the earlyhood attachment need is stronger, because it's more core, if you have attachment abandonment issues at 2 years old, you need to address that before you deal with 30-year-old rage and stuff like that. The patient that needs the most help will go into a pampering of the practitioner. And Bessel van der Kolk does a wonderful job of spoofing himself, in these kind of situations. And he's a strong enough character, meaning Bessel van der Kolk is an unusual white man in a culture that can't make mistakes and that can't apologize. He's an unusual white man in that he can spoof himself. He's almost single-handedly written the trauma history in the United States. So he can make fun, about how he fucked up with this patient and how he fucked up with that patient and how he doesn't know what he's doing here. But people who are very insecure, who don't have that thing, who are very desperate, like maybe I don't know what I'm doing, they often can't handle that. Which is why the therapist needs to protect themselves and their patient by creating a protocol that rewards the client for their candor rather than punishing them. And this is actually one of the issues that I'm most concerned about, because I know a number of trauma and abuse survivors in the community that I see behaving sycophantically in relationship to you. And I think that, again, because you're above average and because you're core in meeting the need of belonging, I think they'll say anything that you need them to say, as long as you tell them they're great and you want them around. And I think some of these people are hurting themselves and are passing diseases on to the community. And you don't see it because you don't have enough therapeutic training to understand these pitfalls and get help. See, you're really protecting yourselves. If you understand that every abuse survivor is going to try and enact their abuse with you, the obvious intelligent response, which any good psychotherapist, psychologist will do, is they're first going to do a diagnosis and history and gain trust before doing anything, because what they want to do is they want to understand what your abuse system is so that they can expect and prepare for you inviting them to abuse them. So a good therapist says, oh, okay, my job is not to abuse the person in the way they invite me to abuse them. How am I going to do it? Well, I've got to figure out how they were abused. And then I've got to teach them that there's a new way of relating that doesn't involve them being abused to get love. Why is this even necessary? This is necessary when you have grandiose parents like my father, who just died, saying that he's loved me unconditionally since the day he was born. It's a great statement. It just correlated with a lot of beating, a lot of shame, a lot of betrayal, a lot of humiliation, a lot of loneliness, a lot of emotional distance, a lot of panic and terror. So if you can equate doing that from an infant to 40 years old with unconditional love, then he did indeed love me very unconditionally. But this is actually a layer of abuse. This is why you have such a difficult job as a therapist, is because the parents have already done what you've done. The parents have already hurt the child, abandoned the child, betrayed the child to such an extent that traumatic and abusive symptoms have emerged. The parent has felt guilty, resentful, angry, hate, scared of being caught, the whole thing. And to protect themselves, they've said, this is love. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. You know, this is love. I love you. This is all for your own good. Da, 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 da. And so the child actually, unable to break free of the power structure in a dependent relationship, rewires their brain to say this is love. So then you as a therapist come in and reenact the wound and say, we love you. This is love. Da, 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 da. And there's no conscious brain in there that can say, no, this is abuse, and can stop you. Which is why you have to understand the abuse and help re-educate the patient on what abuse is before you do anything. You need to know if you're even capable of helping. And not one of you did this, which is why we're here. This is key. It's protocol is what I'm trying to get at, is its protocols. So what kind of a mechanism would it need to be? An app where after each therapeutic session a client says, we would, sees a video from all the facilitators or the therapists and that says, we would be so grateful if you'd help us improve. And what we want to know about this session is, 1, did you ever leave your body? 2, were your muscle tense? 3, what degree? See, now, if you're trained in psychology and trauma, you start to know what this means. You may not know what this means, so this might be overwhelming for you. But if you understand psychology, you start to know that what we're really asking here is, did I take you into traumatic terrain? 2, did you feel safe? What's your energy level? Did your energy level come out higher or lower after the session? How much did you learn that you didn't know, 1 to 10? How safe do you feel, 1 to 10? What can I do better? Do you know what you're doing here? Or are you just here because that's the thing to do? What's worked for you before? What's da-da-da-da-da? See, and an app can gather metadata about these things, and an app will create a profile about you. An app will say, all the men that Peter Sandhill is attracted to go away feeling hyper this or that unless they're gay or whatever. An app can gather patterns that a human being's brain cannot gather. Ray Dalio is doing some beautiful work about decision-making and corporate and hedge fund work with app technology, and it's not hard to do. I'm developing an app that's more sophisticated than this right now in response, because when pain is this intense, it's like die or respond. And when we're dealing with community patterns, meaning trauma, I cannot deal with that on my own. I have one hope of this life ever being worth living. And that's finding a community that is able and willing to navigate in these waters. Because I'm very clear I can't do it alone. And I have a 10% chance of that, frankly. So I'm in extraordinary amounts of depression, pain, shame, with a 10% chance. And that's enough to want to die. And it's why it is so heartbreaking when each of you take positions that make it harder. Every single thing that you've done, this isn't a high issue. Peter Sandhill blaming me, shaming me, venting his energy at me rather than taking energy off of me has made it harder, because you're the above average community. And you may be one of the best in the United States, which is both a huge compliment, kudos to you, and it's also an insult, because the United States is so terrible when it comes to this domain. I mean, I'd rather be in Denmark, I'd rather be in Thailand, I'd rather be in Brazil, I'd rather be in Mexico. I mean, there's almost nowhere I can't go where emotional well-being goes up in these states, because we're such a masculine and male and masculine chauvinistic, not just male. Some of the women are the worst. They're just hammering it in, hammering it in. You know how much hatred I've received for being needy? How much abandonment I've received for being needy? In a healthy culture, need is a trigger for response to the need. In a shaming and incompetent culture, need is a trigger for shame and ostracization. We are in an unhealthy culture, and you are a part of that unhealthy culture. This isn't a high issue. We're not going to read this. Da, 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 da. Now, I don't know if you can change, and I haven't addressed everything that I want to address in the balancing. See, because what I'm looking for is a rupture of the power structure. Meaning you have betrayed your roles in the power structure. You have not understood them. You have not trained for them. You have not occupied them. You have not put your responsibility to your patient as the number one thing. And so you might reach a point where the pressure of fear and the lawsuit and all that gives the positive in you a point where you can just do a 180 and get out ahead of this. That would be so wonderful for me. It'd be so wonderful for yourselves in the high community. It would be a heroic, transcendent moment for yourselves and your organization to transcend your personal stuffs about this by asking for help, by being transparent, by owning everything dark in the dynamic. Owning it. See, and it's a principle here. You know, when a surgeon who needs to do, set a bone instead damages the heart, it's not that the patient arrived in perfect condition, but it just, we respect our doctors because they take it to heart. I fucked up here, and we do this pretty good in physical arenas. We do it terribly emotionally. We don't own our impact as physicians in mental emotional terrain. So the medicine that I'm searching for is, first of all, brilliant transparency. Ironically, it's one of my safety mechanisms. But in this case, it's pushed against me, meaning, the more open I get, the more it brings about this fear and stuff in the community and in you. So it's too much, I think, for an outlier to lead while in a traumatic state, a community that has plenty of its own cultural blind spots and loyalty to the existing power structure into that degree of transparency. But you can do it. And what I'm hoping is that by allying your coping mechanism of terror and looking bad with either getting out in front of the lawsuit or responding, before it gets in all the newspapers, something like that, that this will turn your defense mechanism into alliance with who you are and who your organization needs to be. And that now you'll have 2/3 of you going for it, as opposed to the cultural wound and the coping mechanism blocking and obscuring who you are and who your organization is and needs to be by, the whole thing. Like, secrecy seems to work for the US government, right? Julian Assange holed up in an apartment in London. What's his name? Snowden, sanctioned in Russia. For what? Freedom of the press and for telling us what's going on. See, these are the power structures. So this seems to, enemy number one. So this is what I would expect from your wound, your coping mechanism, which has been birthed in the United States, is I am enemy number one because I'm going to bring to light everything that's not working. Because for my health and for the health of the mission and the organization, that needs to be known by everyone. The more people that know it, the better. And the more people that know how to respond and cooperate, the better. The more people that see the disease, the more people can protect against it. This is good. What isn't good is the pattern of scapegoating. And this is actually one of my biggest angers. And it's the part where, you need to understand there's an element of revenge in this. And the question is, if you understand ecology, revenge doesn't come out of thin air. It requires an environment that's conducive to revenge. It requires very certain emotional states, and it is a coping mechanism. What you need to understand is that revenge is a form of adaptive medicine. Now, you may not understand this, but if you have the good fortune, I hope you get to talk with someone of Bessel van der Kolk's caliber. If you understand revenge and you understand what its function is and what creates it, you can see how you are 60%, you are bringing 60% of the elements to create this very rare state in me, meaning I have never been in this state in my adult life. I had it with, in my kind of 0 to 8-year-old range, with my parents producing the same environment that you produced here. But if you understand that revenge is not mystical, it's not innate to the person, it is an ecological sound created when this vibration interacts with this vibration, interacts with this vibration, interacts with this vibration, interacts with this vibration, and goes in a certain pattern. The result is revenge. The result is hate. The result is despair. See, now, you think the way most of us in our culture think, because we're emotionally illiterate. You think, bury my head in the sand, run away, bad guy, all this stuff. Why is he doing this? This is all the dissociation from the ecological connectedness. But in fact, if we go back to that analogy, there are environments that are so clean that revenge cannot exist. And I want to tell you about one of them because it's it's one of the data reference points in this. It's quite striking. I did a couple of constellation therapy sessions as one of the ways to cope with it. And because I've been so betrayed by human beings, and because, one of the biggest crises when you've had 4 of your therapists and your leaders bringing out the worst in you and then shaming and blaming you and abandoning you in that state, which is what's happened here, is that you cannot trust other people. I mean, it's hard enough when you've been traumatized and abandoned and betrayed by your community and parents and all that. But when your therapists start doing it and your loving leaders start doing it, it's just too much for an individual to deal with that. So I had to be adaptive. So I did constellation work with deities, meaning normal family constellation work. You talk to other human beings. You know, when I would bring you guys into the chair, you know, if you know anything about constellation therapy, I mean, I would be dealing with such a soot of, you know, just pile of pitch. It's like, I just can't deal with it. So I got you out of the space and I brought in deities. So I got to interact with deities. Now, this is going back into that environment, you know, like I've known from my experiments in open relationship that I'm a different person in response to every single person I relate to. And so I really get to learn about the environment that another person or a group of people provide for me, as opposed to who I innately am, meaning I'm a probability field. I interact with someone who values this and who praises this and who loves this, and I become this. I interact with someone who hates and shames this, and I become this. I'm a probability field. And there's an alchemical reaction as I enter the environment that I'm in, where I become someone that I am not anywhere else except in the environment of that person or that group or that whatever. And so this is a very empowering insight, because every time I became someone I didn't like, I would just disengage. One of the things that's unique about this and why I'm bringing it to court is that I couldn't disengage from you, but I watched myself enter the darkest terrain I've ever engaged. I couldn't disengage because when you're in trauma, what you need is secure attached relationships more than anything else, and high has been my reservoir for that. And yet you were the source of the abuse, so it was pulling, you know, the need to disengage and dissociate for trauma protection with the need to belong and repair the trauma were put in tension. You divided your patient and ripped them apart rather than integrated them. This is not medicine, it is abuse. It is soul-wrenching, gut-wrenching dissociation. And in that situation, in that situation with the deity bringing in constellation therapy, I can trust a deity. I can't trust human beings. I can trust a deity. And of course, there was no shame. There was no stress. There was no misunderstanding. There was no loneliness. There was no pain. Everything that I've always wanted with people is and was there in the interface with a deity. With a deity. A deity not limited to language, not limited to culture, not carrying the cultural wound, with no agenda. Deities don't have. Deities don't have agendas. And so I could feel that complete cessation. And so, you know, one of the reasons I'm in some ways more concerned with you than me, you know, because it pivots. You know, there's parts of me lost in pits around this that I need to recover. There's parts of me that need to fight this to feel like I'm not in terror of being abused the next time. You know, so you have to understand that when you don't provide medicine as practitioners, the patient will seek medicine in the most adaptive, effective way that they know how. And if you understand that that's not your enemy, that's an adaptive mechanism that, you know, like the worst thing that could possibly happen, just so you kind of are aware of that, is that I die in addiction and suicide with Devang proceeding with his mandate of making a complete documentary and engaging therapists all around the world about why and how this happened and how the culture can learn from it. Because that's part of my selfless light. Whether I live or die, light is going to come into these places. Now, for you, this is terror, because this is breaking your coping mechanism of hiding and calling shame love and all that. For you, this is absolute terror. But for the society, it is medicine. It is medicine to understand how leaders abuse positions, how language is used to turn, toxins into gold, but poison the patient. This is medicine. So one of the biggest things we have is the essence of me bringing light into dark places, which I began in my teens with the writing of 5,000 poems, most of which began in very dark places and worked with transcendence and transformation. The essence of me, hello, let's see this, let's bring light in here, is at odds with your coping mechanism, which says, we're all wonderful, nothing to learn here, we don't want to meet with you, no, we don't want to talk with this, da-da-da-da-da, no, this isn't a high issue, da-da-da. You've got a coping mechanism that is at odds with your patient's light. And you've betrayed your patient to protect your coping mechanism. Well, this is what people do all the time in relationship. The problem is, see, you haven't apologized, you haven't owned it. All of you. You haven't lifted the weight off, which means you're not safe to lead. See, when you're bigger than your coping strategy, everyone has a coping strategy and it's full of shit. When you're bigger than your coping strategy and you say, I'm transcending, I'm sacrificing my coping strategy, and I'm doing it like this. 1, I'm going to be visible. 2, I'm going to have my true self feel the painful impact I've had. 3, I'm going to change the environment within the power structure that's created this. See, why is it that good people that end up in the US government end up being assholes? See, it's not the people, it's the power structure, it's the protocol. It's the reward, punishment, coping mechanism. We don't have enough time for this, so let's pretend it's not happening. That's a coping mechanism. But when you have app and metadata, for example, when everyone in the community is doing periodic updates, how's their finances doing? How's their loneliness doing? How's their shame doing? Were they sexually molested? See, I've witnessed sexual molestation within the community. I've witnessed death within the community. I've witnessed suicide within the community. I've witnessed lies within the community. I've witnessed betrays in the community, in you and in the community. This is happening as we speak. It's happening as we speak to our people. And the question is, do you care enough about the goodness in them to take the dysfunction of the environment off of them and to start responding to what's coming out of that metadata? People want to keep it confidential, whatever, fine. 3 people were raped within the community in the last month. They don't want to come forward, but that's what we're dealing with our community. Let's talk about this. How does this happen? Maybe one of them is honored enough to come forth. What needs to happen for this metadata to lead to a real commitment that people win? Do we downgrade the mission statement to we do what we can when convenient inside a workshop? That would be fine. That doesn't create too much betrayal. Or do we upgrade the promise with the protocols necessary to realize it? Because you are not committed to my winning. I have failed in every one of my 30 high lover relationships. They have failed in every one of my 30 high lover relationships. I have failed in every one of my relationships with you. You have failed in every one of your relationships with me. Now, this doesn't negate the wins. I have won in every single relationship. I have succeeded. But we're dealing with the failure here. And failure is actually where we need to be looking, because the brain prioritizes pain, shame, threat, and failure at a to 1 ratio of positive, which means that if you reduce a threat, you get way more benefit. Like if you reduce 1 unit of threat, it's the equivalent of adding 5 units of benefit. So that's the place to start until there are no threats, until there are no rapes happening in the community, until there is no violence happening in the community, until there is no betrayal in the community. That is the place to emphasize, because of the brain's emphasis on the negative. Really hear that. Know that it takes one person in trauma to activate the sense that everyone is not safe. Which is why it is the community's primary responsibility that as soon as someone enters a traumatic state, and the level of responsibility should, number one, if a facilitator is taking money to abuse a patient, that is kind of epicenter. Everyone needs to be on board to heal that. If they're not, there's no basis for this community to exist. And it will not exist in a real way. Will not exist in a real way. It will be, we all cobble around, avoid this topic, avoid that, It's not real. It's not real. Until we can face the deepest, most big energies present in any one of us with competence, with commitment, with a clear understanding that if we don't stop this AIDS virus in you, it's going to spread to others. If we don't stop this violence virus in you, it's going to spread to others. If we don't stop this betrayal in you, it's going to spread to others. Because that's what's happening, isn't it? You refuse to stop the viruses that you injected into me. Peter Sandhill, Sarah Sandhill, facilitators, Jason. You refused, board. You refused to learn what was needed to stop the virus. So it is infecting your spaces, because that's part of ecological evolution. See, the ego pretends like, oh, that's not me, that's their stuff, that's their story, blah, 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 blah. Try that in a garden where nature doesn't lie to you like that. No. A plant gets infected with aphids. Nobody does anything about it. The other plants get infected with aphids. Someone gets a cold. Nobody takes any protection. The other people have. Someone has herpes, doesn't wear a condom. Everyone else. It's no different emotionally, etc. So when someone says my life is on the line, I'm in horrible loneliness, I'm in da-da-da-da-da, it's like that's not a high issue. Ah, I see. Let's see how you survive that game. See, so going back to the revenge, there is a year of my life, maybe 2, it's about 18 months, where the only thing getting my adolescent, the one you hurt the most, the one least competent to deal with the terrain you thrust me into, the only thing getting them out of bed is how are we going to get these fuckers? You see, and this is a survival mechanism. You've created that, Peter Sandhill, with your hubris, with your lies, with your ignorance, with your stupidity, with your lack of grace, with your lack of help. You have created 18 months as a landscape. Like, this is in the landscape of the psyche. So this is an age range, where I was regressed, terrified of life, absolutely in shame and loneliness. And the only thing that person can think is, I'm not going to die just yet. See, I'm not going to die. You can thank that adolescent for not dying. Because you're going to end up in prison if I'm dead. Because I have done the research, and there's no one going to back your strategies up around this. Every good trauma specialist is saying, wow, you disconnected his email account, you reduced his support, da-da-da-da-da. You know, the list is quite long of what you did and didn't do. See, and that my adolescent would just love to mow you down. So, you see, but that doesn't come out of nowhere. That adolescent has liked you. That adolescent has trusted you. That adolescent has learned and respected you. But not in this terrain. You see, and if you really understand chemistry, see, obviously you don't, but if you really understand chemistry, you know that muriatic acid and cement interact like this, and the cement dissolves. And you know it doesn't happen just with the concrete, it doesn't happen just with the acid, it happens in the chemistry. And your job as professionals, your job is to have a chemistry that medicines, that heals, that integrates your clients. And if you do not have that, your job is to know that and refer them to someone else, and or to learn and to apologize for your impact. That is your job. It's not your client's job to figure out how mental emotional chemistry works any more than it's my client's job to hire me as a landscape designer and installer, and me just to show up and ruin their garden and say, what do you want me to do? You know, it's not their job. It's the professional's job. And if you don't own that, you devalue the role, meaning if you tell all your clients up front, full disclosure, we don't know what we're doing. We may or may not abuse you. If we do abuse you, we may make it worse, and it's your fault anyway, and we're going to call all that love. If you tell someone up that front, you've just destroyed your role. It doesn't exist. It goes up in smoke. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? What's the protocol? What's the defense? Are you going to weep in court? Are you going to tell the jury how much you loved and da-da-da-da-da? Will it work? Will that defense work? Who will believe you in your community that you're doing the best for your patients? I asked Peter Sandhill 2 years ago when he told me in one of his many alienating comments about how he's got his own somatic therapist, he's started yoga, he's getting enough sex, he's enjoyed the team workshop, he's done all this stuff for him in this complete myopia of self-centeredness. And I said, I don't have any of that. Will you find me a somatic therapist? He had to think about it for several days. You know, it's a big, big issue. But think about it. He came back and said, fine, I'll pay for 8 sessions. Very magnanimous. And I said, great, I'm waiting. Never happened. There wasn't, I'm so sorry, I can't even find you a therapist. I can do it for myself, but I can't do it for you. No. Because I'm, of course, the important one. I'm the doctor, right? I've got to apply medicine and all that. I can't give you a refund, of course, because I've consulted with an attorney. I'm spending money with an attorney to protect me, of course. Me, Peter Sandhill. I'm spending money with an attorney. And you know what she said? Because we're focused on you, the patient. You know what she said? She said, you, Dane, need to treat Peter like the South African Congress of, the peaceful thing where you tell the story, but there's a catch. First of all, so let's spend money to protect Peter, of course, not to protect Dane. Let's talk about advice that's good for Peter, not Dane. Let's not spend any money on Dane. Let's spend it on Peter because we love you so much, right? You see, this is